So thank you for hearing that. And again, thank you for being part of this webcast. And now let's meet today's presenter, Jason Macedonia. Jason is the Senior Director of Employee Engagement Services for MaritzCX, where he leads strategy, design, and administration of employee engagement solutions. Now, prior to MaritzCX, Jason served as Senior Vice President of Strategy at Avatar Solutions, which is an innovator in the patient experience, or the PX space. And there he designed and oversaw customer and employee programs for organizations including Mayo Clinic, Kaiser Permanente, Dignity Health, and University Health System Consortium. Jason is also a contributing member to the Barrel Institute Body of Knowledge and Experience Measurement. He has more than 15 years of experience with customer and employee engagement programs. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Business Management with emphasis in organizational development and a Master's of Business Administration from Stetson University. And a little fun fact, just a few weeks ago, Jason was shown on ESPN when he caught a home run ball at the Atlanta Braves season home opener. So he's now added that to his already impressive list of accomplishments. So, Jason, I'm going to turn over to you now, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that home run ball and your ESPN premiere.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to participate. I'm very impressed with the list of registrants, and in particular the breadth and variety of organizations represented from all verticals and all different industries. So my hope today is to focus on the connection between employee experience and CX, customer experience. The idea being that you'll have some good takeaways, some clever ideas, some connections that we've seen in the data, and in particular things that link these two verticals and these two important aspects of the business. Just to revisit quickly that story that Tom shared, because my level of excitement just continues to grow on it. Here's a picture of where I was sitting in the Braves Stadium for that home opener. And just by way of story, this was an exciting opportunity for me as a customer of a ball game, in particular because I'm a raging baseball fan, but I don't go to very many games at all. And in part, that's due to the fact that I live in Florida, but I am a Chicago Cubs fan, and so difficult to get to those games. It just so happened that the Braves were playing the Cubs for their home opener. So at this particular game, my best friend and I were sitting in the outfield, of course. He got up to leave, and quote unquote, I define that as a lack of engagement in the game, if you will. At the same time, about the third inning, there was a home run ball hit by last year's Rookie of the Year in the National League. And as that ball was coming toward our section, and I'm watching it, I'm immediately thinking about the statistics behind the event. What are the chances that this ball is going to come to me, and how low are they? What are the chances if it comes anywhere near me that I'll have the wherewithal to catch it? So on and so forth. And as I'm thinking about those statistics and less about catching the ball, you can see here is a picture from ESPN. And for those that have never done it, when you're in the outfield and there's a home run, the first thing that you do after you get home from the game is go to the highlights and go to the recording, in this case, and then take pictures of yourself on TV. And so as I did that, I came to discover that I was well captured in camera on screen. This is me kind of in the middle. You can see everyone's watching me. Feel like a man on an island here by myself. And if you look very closely, you can see the baseball in my hand there as I'm in the aisle catching it. And there's nothing like the feeling of catching a home run. Unfortunately, though, I wasn't engaged enough to remember to use two hands. And when the ball entered my hand and then my hand hit the railing next to it, I, of course, dropped the ball. And when you drop the ball in a game like this and with an experience like a home run catch, all you're left with is a picture of your hand and the pain and the numbness you feel after you have that experience. So I was lucky. I felt really fortunate to catch the ball, so to speak. I lost it. Another Braves fan got it. And I'm lucky that when I got home, my 4.5-year-old, who was excited to see me on TV, didn't think to say, "Hey, Dad, where's the ball?" Why do I share this story? I don't know. It's a recent event in my life, but in particular, I think one of the lessons that I learned that relates to this is that you've got to be fully engaged. In this case, using 2 hands would have been smart. And being fully engaged is generally a theme organizationally when we think about the data between customer and employee. And in particular, in employee engagement, individual employees being fully committed to the work that they do and connected to the impact that they have on customer outcomes. And so with that, I'd like to begin today's presentation with a little on the importance of connecting EX and CX. And there are few presentations that I deliver that I don't use or where I don't use this particular model to describe the importance, especially because it illustrates the foundation upon which any good customer experience is built. And we know that the people within the organization are the filter by which the customer experiences your organizational culture. They are the ones that deliver the experience, and they're the ones where you can make great change from training, from engagement, from connecting the dots, and see a positive impact on the outcomes on the customer side. When we build engagement programs in particular and we focus on the people, there are some specific things that are important to do and that are important to understand. One is that we ideally want to measure experiences as they occur. And more organizations are embracing more open listening strategies, more active measures, pulse surveys, and rejecting the notion that employee engagement is just an annual endeavor, a one-time event for employees at a point in time. We also want to demonstrate back to employees that we're using their feedback, and in so doing, continue to get suggestions, ideas, and insights from the employee base. Those insights often help us identify gaps or changes in processes that may be needed, in particular those that may directly influence the way the employee feels about delivering a positive customer experience, or if the employee is not customer facing, supporting other individuals in the organization and providing service to internal customers. And along with this is the importance of giving employees the ability to share stories. And I think oftentimes, and we'll talk about this today, oftentimes those stories carry a great deal of weight in our decision making and in our opinions in what we can do and the ideas behind what we should do. I also like to say that while culture is an underpinning to all of this, and you see it at the base of the foundation here, it is difficult to change, but culture can be easily defined as simply the things that your people, your employees, do day in and day out. And those collective actions and beliefs today sort of dictate and define your organizational culture. There are, of course, many other ways to slice it. When we dig deeper into the people component of this, though, one of the other important things is that we think about programs as not being just measurement. We need to embrace change. We need to embrace training, communication, awareness. And these are the things that the people within the organization are going to utilize to make change and to do what the organization expects of them. In particular, when we think about communication and awareness, this is really important because it gives the employee a sense of what the expected or intended change should be that incites the behavior shifts we want and the new habits to be formed across the employee base. And we could be thinking very acutely about things that we're asking of them that relate to the customer experience and what we learn from our customers. It could, too, be related to internal things that we as an organization embrace that will engage and further excite or allow the employee to develop on their own. Along with that, of course, is training. The how-tos, identifying the best practices and sharing those within the organization, and giving employees the knowledge to be able to do what it is that they need to do to perform best. And so inherent in this dialogue and in this information are a couple of things: engagement and how the employee feels, and also delivery and what they know, their ability to deliver in their function. With regard to some of these programs, there are some things that we see as best practices, including making and promoting great awareness around what the organization is trying to accomplish. So as you are delivering or building programs, extending or evolving the work that you're doing, especially on the CX side, think about ways that you can create a brand for the program or initiative that you have and make that brand present and obvious to the employees. These are some examples where behind the scenes collateral, visuals, communications can really connect the employee to the mission that you're doing, and embrace the training. Branding that training, making it attuned to the work that you're doing, all of these things have a very significant impact on the success of connecting the employee and leveraging the employee in the work that you do. On screen is a great example of a particular program that we're familiar with, where the organization said, we want to increase happiness in the workplace. And they created and branded a project they called the Joy Project. It used a number of different things to allow employees to record and share their stories and experiences. Also used electronic posters, e-posters, if you will, emailers, behind-the-scenes huddle guides, training content, and additional information that made it very prevalent to the employee that this was the project they were working on, and these are the things and the objectives at hand. Some of this resonated with customers as well and was actually customer-facing, but most of it was behind the scenes with employees. And again, a great example to bring that brand and that awareness to the forefront. Now, as we get into the data and we look at some of the impact, one of the things that we've observed many times in this work, and that certainly connects customer and employee, are these particular drivers. In question here, the employee's perception of being able to impact quality, cost, and of course, customer service. And if you've seen this data before, you know that if you look at the employees who are disengaged in an organization, less than 30%, or right about 30% of them, agree that they can impact quality, impact cost, and impact customer service. And if you are able to move that group not to be highly engaged, but just to be moderately engaged, move those disengaged up just a little bit, you can really double up on these percentages and on this impact. Never mind ultimately getting to highly engaged where you have an additional lift. So those measures help us understand some of the kind of out of the gate connections that we can make and the impact and influence we have as we move disengaged employees to become more highly engaged. Also important in this work, and that we talk about quite often, is the Kano model. And as you'll remember, the Kano model, of course, begins with the satisfaction index, dissatisfied to totally satisfied, and then the achievement axis of didn't do it at all versus did it very well. And there are a couple reasons why this model is important for these connections. But as I explained the model, we know that we have things that are expected, especially from the customer side. These are the must-haves. If we don't have them, the customer is dissatisfied. We also have the normal quality, or the basic wants, the things that are expected, the things that satisfy the customer. And finally, we have the things that are delighters. These are the things that wow the customer, the things that oftentimes customers aren't thinking of. And it becomes very difficult sometimes to identify what those delighters are, in particular because as time passes, what was once a delighter becomes more expected. So for example, and the example I often use is in the hotel industry. If you think about the last time you stayed at a hotel, the things that you remember typically are not that you had pillows on your bed and you weren't excited that you had a lock on your door or hot water in the shower. If you didn't have those things, you were immediately dissatisfied. Those are the basic needs. But if you have them, you aren't engaged or excited about the particular service or product. This is important from a model perspective for two main reasons. One, in this work, one is that the engaged employee is the one who is most likely to be thinking about the delighters from a customer experience perspective and also be able to or positioned to deliver them. And so moving engagement allows for those delighters to become a possibility. The second is that oftentimes when we think about the Kano model and we use these examples, we think about it from the customer's perspective, but this too is important internally in the organization from the employee's perspective. There are things that the organization can do and does that are expected, that are normal satisfiers of work, of the job, of the expectations we have of employees, and also delighters, things that we can do to dramatically shift engagement. And every organization has to find out what those are, apply them in the right ways given your unique industries. But again, be thinking about this model from both perspectives. Now, of course, there's a lot of support and quotes that we could cite around the connections between employee and customer linkage. And these are two that, of course, are very prominent. Frederick Reichheld, of course, said it's nearly impossible to maintain a loyal customer base without a base of loyal employees. And that kind of stands to reason. Richard Branson, always bold. If you take care of your employees, they will take care of clients. The clients do not come first. The employees come first. That isn't something that everyone agrees with, but agree or not, we know that it's true that as employees are taken care of, they're at least better positioned to take care of clients. And so as we dig into some of the findings and some of the data that we have, there are lots of ways where we can bring together eNPS or Employee Net Promoter Score and Customer Net Promoter Score. We can build charts and graphs where we overlay and we dig deeper. And oftentimes we begin there to understand what some of these connections look like. On screen is one such example where a client in financial services implemented an employee training program in their call center, and they plotted these scores together and saw Net Promoter Score on the customer side and employee side improve. I think important with this example is that it doesn't necessarily have to be done at the overall level. It can be done in subgroups. It can be done where we're making unique changes or we're conducting specific training for a subset of employees. And as we do that, it may be an opportune time to look at the connections and overlay data with those subgroups. We also saw a similar relationship for another type of study in telecom, similar example where we implemented a new training and had similar results within the employees in the contact center in that vertical. And then a third example in the insurance sector where there was some initiative by which employees had identified that the communications and some of the things they were sending to customers were not clear. And they needed to make these efforts and these communication protocols more clear and use quote unquote plain English. When they did that, they then followed by looking at both the eNPS and NPS scores from customers, and both improved. Perhaps in part because the employee suggestions were used, and because as customers are more happy, that tends to resonate with employees. However, while we have lots of examples, as I mentioned, of those scenarios, we can also see the reverse. And we can also see instances where there may be something at play that prevents kind of the normal state of those connections to operate like we would think. This is an example where we had a particular client in automotive and roadside assistance, and they had robust job level satisfaction among the weaker performing teams and lower satisfaction on the employee side within the higher performing teams when we looked at CX metrics. And of course, as we dug deeper, what we learned and what we identified or were able to call out was that those higher performing teams were asked to work a lot more and had a greater workload, negatively affecting their individual engagement. So remember that there are acute things that may turn the tide or shift the table in terms of what we might expect as we start to think about what are these connections and what is the impact that engagement has on customer. One of the most cited and certainly important aspects of these connections is the service profit chain. And when developed, the idea was that there was great connection between what the customer sees and what the employee delivers. in that improvement in one will yield improvement in the other. And while it's generally accepted that employee attitudes can be a predictor of the outcomes on a customer side, there's also evidence, in fact, a great deal that shows that the reverse is also true. There's also evidence that shows that these connections can, in fact, be weaker than we want to believe. And as you dig in, and perhaps one of the challenges as we look at this model and we understand some of these connections, lies specifically in what we ask and the metrics that we look at. So making sure that we identify all of the components, work design, rewards recognition, and in particular asking the employee side, do they have the tools for serving customers? And helping them make those connections can help us dig deeper from a model perspective into what we ultimately would find in the data and with regard to these connections. There have been a number of analysis on the service profit chain, and this particular study from OSU, which leveraged Washington Mutual data from some time ago, found that there are specific things that are powerful predictors of satisfaction on the employee side, and in particular that customer impacts employee, less that employee impacts customer. And with that were two kind of key findings. One was that we need, as an organization and as a business, to make sure that we are connecting employees with the impact or the outcomes that we see on the customer side. Are our employees aware of what they're doing, the actions that they take, the processes that they follow, and those resultant, ideally positive impacts on the customer? And are we sharing that kind of data across the employee base? Also, are we helping employees recognize or take credit, whether they were individually responsible or behind the scenes responsible for results? And are we sharing those stories across the organization? Those are two key things that we have to do, and we have to help our employees see in this connection to get the biggest bang for our buck. There were some other links that had strong support. There was strong evidence that customer satisfaction and loyalty drives performance, and in particular that internal service quality, as defined by service climate, impacts employee engagement. And specifically, when we look at service climate, we're referring to things like the perception of the practices and processes that we're asked to follow as employees, the work environment and the leadership, opportunities for advancement, and of course, degree of empowerment, the ability to make those decisions and empowered and supported to do so. Now, we also did a study on our own as we explored the SPC, and some time ago did a poll of our customers. And in so doing, we found that 43% of our customers cited service as a reason for leaving a brand. And of those mentioned, 77% cited that the attitude or behavior was in play. So this study looked at the overall engagement of employees and the link to quality, the drivers or key drivers of service quality, and leveraged specific content around demographics and perceived outcomes. There were a couple, again, key findings from this. We leveraged employee engagement index measures around job, recommend, and happiness in staying with the organization. And of course, customers rating the service as excellent. And what we found is that there was a moderate correlation between engagement and quality here. Employee engagement was linked to customer service, but perhaps not as strongly as we expected. That the key drivers of engagement did not really include customer-focused measures here, but that key drivers of service quality did include customer-focused measures. And importantly, and as I've mentioned before, the employee perceptions or the insights that employees have about being able to deliver on our expectations on a CX program were paramount here. And so as we know, and as we look at across the industry, a typical employee engagement study, those studies are often, of course, centered on the company vision and the leadership, the environment, the personal motivators for the individual employee, with the idea being that we collect, we analyze, we try to make the linkage to customer loyalty, customer outcomes, and ultimately see the business outcomes that we want. But that insight into the customer experience is more specifically something that we would benefit from asking the employee. And what this means is that there's great insight we can learn in leveraging what I like to call a CX delivery survey, where we're asking employees not just about things that impact their engagement specifically, but the things that we are asking of them in delivering against customer expectations. And on screen are some of those themes. Again, going back to things like processes and procedures. Do we have the right kind of incentives and rewards recognition in place? Do we have consistency with how we deliver on experience, and is that known? Are there goals, and is there technology that helps us map that or deliver? And then are we understanding, do we have a sense of what our customers expect and also how we can exceed those? Are we empowered to do that as an employee base? So these are examples of themes and of content that can be added to an engagement survey that will help CX professionals understand the impact on the programs and the expectations they're rolling out. When we look in dashboards, of course, this content can be plotted. This was an example of a dashboard that we've seen with data where in the automotive industry we're plotting these together, we're visualizing higher performance, lower performance, and of course we're cutting this by lots of other demographics within the business units, so on and so forth, so that we can target which employees perhaps we need to activate or review those policies, procedures, technology, and other things that impact the delivery. Now, there's also two more important aspects to this work with regard to the influence that voice of employee has on CX. One, as we've talked about, is the employee engagement in general. And we know that happy employees yield happy customers. It's a simple statement that high levels of engagement allow for lots of business metrics that are positive within the organization. Longevity and tenure of employees, decreased absenteeism, connectedness to the customer, relationships with the customer. All of those things are connected to engagement. Also, customer preparedness. Knowing that employees are connected to the delivery, the service, the promises made by the mission, the vision of the organization, and that they've got continual capability to share from their perspective how the organization is doing. So when we think about the difficulties that lots of organizations face in being siloed between HR and customer experience, we know that oftentimes the data is not as easily available to one group or the other or shared. Of course, the stronger programs are ones where we are sharing that information. We're building and making decisions based on the combination. But for example, if we knew that we had positive customer data and that our scores on the CX side were positive or trending positive, and that on the engagement side we had positive scores, this would be the ideal scenario, and it would be easy to understand perhaps some of the influence between both customer and employee. The reverse is also true. Easier to understand perhaps some of the influence and some of the things at play which would be causing customers or causing staff to be disengaged or unhappy. And in both of these scenarios, of course, the idea is that there's alignment, and it may be easier for us to identify what's going on. But we've got examples where there's a disconnect. And we may see, if we were just looking at customer scores, that our performance is good or that it's trending up. And yet we may, when we look internally at staff scores, we may identify that movement is downward and or that engagement scores are low. And this example, of course, is not sustainable. We would have a leading indicator in looking at the engagement scores that our CX scores are probably not going to remain high or continue to trend up. And so what would we do differently if we had these insights collectively or at the same time and in real time, knowing what are some of the things that are at play that we can change or affect now? So looking at some indirect linkages that I mentioned, things like absenteeism, churn, of course, productivity metrics, and the like, there are lots of things that we can dig into. One example that we looked at in data we analyzed was with regard to absenteeism. And in this particular example, we were trying to identify what the financial implication for this organization was with regard to absenteeism and sickness. and looking at the percent and the discrepancy we have between those that are highly engaged and their use of sick days and of out-of-office time versus those that are medium or low engagement on that spectrum. And it stands to reason we have much more utilization, even in this organization where we had kind of an abnormal, highly engaged percent of employees, not exactly the bell curve that perhaps might be ordinary. So nonetheless, the important piece here is that the financial implication is significant to the organization in just absenteeism alone and what that means financially, but also as you make this connection with customer, being out and not being connected or not being engaged with fellow employees and with customers trickles to lots of other influence on the CX scores and things like revenue and other business metrics. Now, we also did in 2016 and then again in 2018, MaritzCX as an organization conducted a study called CXEvolution. And this was a very robust study of CX professionals globally, where the idea was that we would identify and look at specific best practices and focus on those, but understand some of the connections in the programs and the practices that organizations were using, in particular to get ideal or best case results. And as we did this study, we found that organizations fell into 4 primary stages. On the low end, the emerging stage, moving to attentive, then responsive, and ultimately proactive. And you can see from a customer experience program perspective what each stage entails. From on the stage 1 side, not really having CX programs that have taken hold, believing that we have a minimal impact on customers, versus stage 4, having a pervasive set of data analysis, being predictive, and really getting much deeper in terms of that information. When we looked at this as it connects with employee, what we found was that in stage 1, voice of employee feedback was not generally collected by organizations in this phase. Stage 2, VOE feedback was collected occasionally, and we bucket examples where organizations perhaps are doing a survey every couple of years, every 3 years, less than once a year with their employee base, and in particular, not necessarily giving all employees the opportunity to provide that feedback. When we move to stage 3, the tides turn, and this is where VOE feedback is collected regularly across the organization and much more widespread. And then finally, in stage 4, correlated with CX performance, where organizations are doing a much more robust job of making those connections and looking at the data in a connected way. And of course, with that, we looked at profitability. We know that those organizations in the proactive stage 4 phase are 93% more profitable. And we looked at things like Net Promoter Score, customer retention, financial performance, and also employee-related metrics. Importantly, when we looked at some of the best practices, those that are most common from those organizations, you can see right away that these connect very heavily to employees. In particular, that the documentation procedures are available in real time to all employees, that they all know what they can do and what they should do, whether that's directly with customers or not, that we've got good compliance and that's monitored and enforced, and that we are empowering employees to handle both standard and non-standard situations, and of course a few other examples as well. Also, interestingly, we found that for the percent of companies that were conducting VOE, those in the emerging phase in stage 1, really only 5 were doing it with any regularity or at all. As we would expect, and we move up the chain, attentive and moving to responsive, we see a pretty significant shift there. And by the time we get to stage 4, 99% of these organizations are regularly conducting voice of employee measures and collecting insight from employees. So again, that tells us that there's something going on differently as it relates to the use of VOE with these organizations. Also, when we look at eNPS and Net Promoter Score, we see that this staircase is, as we would expect, with the significant shift between stage 2 and stage 3 moving to the positive, and then an additional significant lift moving to stage 4. And also digging into employees who recommend the organization as a desirable place to work, only 1 out of 2 employees in stage 1 would agree to that. Whereas by the time you get to stage 3 and stage 4, those percentages increase dramatically. Nearly all employees in stage 4 agree that it's a desirable place to work. Digging into financial results, I mentioned 93% more profitable year over year, a 91% higher NPS scores on the customer side, but also almost 90% greater retention year over year of the employee base. And of course, we know that that retention is going to lead to greater connectedness, relationships, providing service to customers. Also, of those where the data showed that employees were completely satisfied with their job, we have 88% better financial performance year over year generally. And also as organizations, highly recommend as a desirable place to work, we have, much better financial performance overall year over year. So when we looked at other components of programs and we looked at other things that we studied in the CXE initiative, we also found that from a success perspective, VOE is significantly correlated with overall stage, and in particular, just doing a voice of employee program helps yield and set the tone for CX success. We also found that from a strategy perspective, there was great significance and correlation between commitment on the strategy by the employee base, compliance with what we're asking of them, and business case scenarios between voice of employee and CX outcome. And then also significant correlation on things like processes, the methodology from a CX perspective, the documentation, and also how we measure those. Now, we also know from the industry in general, there are a number of common employee engagement program problems or issues that underpin either a disconnect in how often we should measure employee or how we onboard these programs. And you can see on screen, this ranges from programs not including all employees, which generally is a mistake, of course, not connecting to organizational metrics. In this case, also connecting to CX metrics and how employees influence those. No action taken from the feedback. If we're asking employees for ideas or for suggestions, especially if we're asking those items about the customer experience delivery and then we're not making change, it's very difficult to sustain that and continue to get insight from our employee base. And so these are some of the common things we need to make sure we avoid when we're onboarding an EX program that we know are going to have impact downstream. When it comes to reducing churn, we've also looked at some of the financial impact of this just from the HR side. And as we look at the numbers and we run some different scenarios, this can be used in any business almost like a calculator where you can plug in the relevant metrics for your organization. But if we assumed that we had just 10 new associates in a 6-month time period, the data supports that we would have 9 out of 10 of those employees make the decision to stay within that first 6 months. This is an extremely vulnerable time for employees. And so we know that we'd have 9 associates at risk, but more importantly, if we had some historical measure of what our attrition rate is, especially among those candidates we bring in the first 6 months, we could almost immediately know what the count of lost associates we could expect would be. Using that information, we can apply some known statistics about the financials, in particular that a certain percent of managers' time is spent on hiring activities as it relates to those associates, and we can monetize what that looks like. Include also the hiring and training costs based on employee salary within that time period. And ultimately what we get is a cost for losing or the attrition associated with those employees. And this just looks at and just examines those that we bring on new that have tenure of less than 6 months. So you can imagine what this looks like across an organization when you widen the scope or spectrum. There are some other related findings that we had in financial services, and in particular as we conducted true driver analysis. We learned and we looked at feeling valued and recommending as a place to work, what was personal to the employee, and also the employee to the customer, their influence on customer recommend to buy, recommend for repair. And what we found in our square here, and not to get too statistical, but these 6 categories, these 6 dimensions of performance, vision, values, teamwork, the right people, right job, leadership, and accountability, these kind of accounted for 90% of the variability in how an employee felt valued. And you can see what that percentage looked like across the board again when it came to desirable place to work, recommending to buy, and recommend for repair. Also with this, when we looked at sales in particular in automotive, we identified that improving certain elements of the employee aspect had impact on customer, and that 1/5 of the variation in CSI scores could be explained in some way by employee engagement measures. So again, some data that alludes to or points to those connections. Now I've got a couple of visual examples in a way connected to automotive, and I just want you to consider these outcomes. The first is this visual. This was a parking space apparently that was painted or plotted out to be painted by an employee of whatever organization does this, but there's a pole in the middle of the parallel parking spot. True engagement. Here's another example where we painted an arrow on the road that leads directly to a pole within a parking lot. And I don't know if maybe that was done because we had a pothole or a manhole cover adjacent to it that also looks pretty daunting, but nonetheless, some additional thought might have been warranted here by the people performing that job. And then my favorite is this one, where we clearly have a lack of engagement here. And these are just kind of quirky examples meant to illustrate, the impact that an individual's engagement who performs work can have on the outcome and on the recipient or the user of the service or product. I think one of the things that we can do, and one of the reasons these examples are good, is because we as leaders in an organization can find such examples in our businesses, maybe in pictures, maybe in data or stories, and especially stories, where this may be true or the reverse is true. And ideally, and as a best practice, leaders in an organization will take examples of what employees have done that have yielded positive customer outcome, either supporting one another or directly influencing the customer, that connect engagement with that outcome. And as we share those stories, we know that those are very powerful. They resonate with the employee base. They give employees an example internally and a set of standards by which to live by and operate by. At the end of the day, we're all in this together. There's lots of ways that we can cut and slice data to look at connections. And there are 3 examples of models we sort of alluded to and shared herein that help us understand how employees play that key role in delivering that customer experience, both consistently and well. One, again, as we've talked a little bit about, is linking voice of employee measures downstream, looking at things like churn, customer outcomes, absenteeism, and being able to answer these questions. How do the DOE metrics drive NPS downstream, change behaviors? How do they drive internal costs, again, related to some of these aspects of an employee and connectedness to the work that they do? In Model 2, using true driver analysis, looking at VOE and specific metrics that drive improvement that are customer focused. And third, operationalizing some of those linkages and attributes. What internal processes or practices affect the employee? Which ones empower the employee? What kind of opinions do we have in terms of the way that they're used and the way the employee engages in those efforts? Now, we also know that there are lots of ways we can ask employees questions and we can get at this data. MaritzCX, by way of example, has built a suite we call the AgileEX suite. And Agile really was meant to be very intentional to denote flexible, the ability to not require a change to an existing survey, perhaps that the organization uses, but to build programs around it. And as we did that, there were three really key things that we kept in mind. One was thinking about the individual employee and going back to how they feel and what they know. We created the Fast Track Engagement Survey that focuses on eNPS and does that. It's a laser focus on the drivers at the individual employee level. But we also know that as time progresses, those employees will pass through specific events. They'll pass through business examples and experiences that influence their engagement and influence their ability to provide customer service. And so pulse surveys that focus on those events help us get that data in real time. And then finally, from some of the underpinnings in the organization, we've got a tool, the Engagement Potential Index. The idea behind this tool is that we measure some of the effectiveness behind any existing HR programs and perhaps identify where we can invest more to get the biggest bang for our buck organizationally. There are some creative ways that MaritzCX has deployed Agile strategies and asked our own employees for insights and some of this connectedness. And I'll peel back the onion and share a few of those. At a very basic level, one example is that we do monthly town hall meetings. And in that process, we embed links or we provide employees with the ability to ask questions in real time, but also the ability to react to specific content that's delivered in those communications. And that gives our leadership team the ability to follow up, channel the right kind of messaging in response to what employees are saying and how they're reacting to the information shared. Every month we do an HR electronic newsletter. In that newsletter, there often is a button that invites or asks for some specific insights or ideas from the employee base, or provides at least a general opportunity for insider feedback. As we make change organizationally, and specifically when we did a new performance review process, we embedded a survey at the end of that new process to follow up and ask employees what they thought of the change as they had immediately experienced it. And that helped us make additional changes or modifications to the way we did performance reviews. And then finally, gamification. And in particular, this is effective with the younger population and leveraging technology. But we don't have to think of surveys as a way to just ask and receive data or collect data. We can use the technology to deliver. We can do it with training. We can do it with education, with just sharing information. And when you add gamification to that, the example we had was that we conducted a daily poll, which was more about knowing what the benefits are that are provided to employees and making sure that employees were aware of all that the organization does to support and provide them from a benefits perspective. So whether you do a raffle, whether you use the technology to create a game out of the process, it's about educating and providing information, not just collecting insight. Going back to the life cycle, it's also common to follow kind of start to finish the process that an employee follows. And what better time than as you bring in a new associate or employee to make sure that you begin this rigor and this protocol with them, making sure that from a cultural perspective, they know there are regular opportunities to provide feedback, but also upfront to get immediate comparison to why they chose your organization in the first place. It's common that an employee you bring on has also interviewed with your competitors and or had other opportunities within the industry. And it's great to, out of the gate, know culturally how you were different, perhaps why or to what extent the culture was influential in them choosing your organization, and also how they believe they can help impact the customer up front as they begin their career with your institution. Moving through, getting to things like onboarding and acclimation, making sure as an organization we follow up, that we continue to monitor, do employees have the tools to perform the work they need to do, especially with customer-facing employees, and do they continue to feel connected to their work? Do they see the influence that they have on the customer? Is that data shared? Is it observed in the work they do day in and day out? And then, of course, as we move through the process, following training and development opportunities, communication, as I mentioned in the town hall example, rewards recognition, all the way through exit surveys, where we kind of have the last opportunity to understand from the employee their total experience with us as an organization. And so I close with, again, this model that the people truly are the building block for delivering the customer experience, creating and shaping those outcomes. To the extent that we can capture feedback from them in real time as events occur, leverage real-time data, make sure that we embed awareness and training in those processes and not just measurement, and also proving back that we are using the employee insights, suggestions, data that we have and making change. This has a significant impact and, of course, a positive impact on the business as a whole. And so with the remaining time we have, I'll open it up to questions. And Tom, maybe you can take a crack at some of the questions we have.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Thanks for the presentation. Really, really good ideas, great tips for that. Gosh, EX is so critical in establishing that CX culture. And hey, if your employees aren't feeling the love, your customers probably aren't either. So it's great to keep those initiatives aligned. And so great insight there into the impact of the EX program. Very helpful data. Yeah, we have a bunch of questions, and I can guarantee you we're not going to have enough time to get into every one of them. So if we don't get to your question during this time, we will follow up with you afterwards and an email directly to you with your answer to your question. So thank you for submitting those. But let's jump in. Jason, how do you see leadership playing a role in connections on engagement and CX outcomes?
That's a great question. I think that there are probably two primary ways with regard to leadership that are really critical. One, and this is always suggested, that there is a great deal of communication to the employees from leadership. And I think in particular with this connection on CX data, to the extent that leaders can make the connection for employees, that they not just support organizationally collecting and measuring engagement and collecting ideas, but that they also present back to employees the influence on business outcomes. Those may be financial, they may be process related. Those kinds of stories are huge, and that communication from leadership is very significant to employees at all levels. I think, as I say that, one of the things that goes along with that, and I have some experience in lots of industries with this, it's very common, despite the fact that as CX leaders or EX professionals or HR leaders, and our willingness and idea to collect lots of data that's statistically significant that gets used by our executives, it's common that an individual story, in particular a unique comment, is most discussed in meetings and leadership meetings, even up to the board. And so those stories really have a very powerful effect. They can help us make sense out of the data, but they're also generally used and often cited. And so again, I think that's really important. The other thing, if there were two things, the other thing I would say is rounding. And to the extent that your organization can allow or embrace leadership rounding, leaders reaching out either in person or electronically to connect with individual employees, understand their perspective, understand their story, collect what they need. That shows a strong commitment from senior leadership down to the employee base. Of course, it doesn't mean that we have to reach everyone, but it does from a leadership perspective help with that connection. Okay, great. Thanks, Jason.
Next question, do you recommend a survey change for organizations who already have an existing annual employee survey?
That's interesting because I would say no, we don't. And really the reason is because if you feel like your existing, for example, annual employee engagement survey is working for you, we wouldn't recommend a change. Continue to use it, continue to leverage it to the extent that it works. I think, though, what I would recommend is that you consider ways to build around it and more dynamically, more regularly get insight that's going to allow you to influence perhaps those measures and others that we've discussed today in the presentation, especially those that help you especially the CX professionals on the call today, understand the connection that employees are making with your expectations and what you're asking of them on a program perspective. There's lots of questions we get, and I see one here too about the frequency. What's the ideal frequency? I think you have to determine that for yourself following the journey. I would say those journey points are really important because those are major events that impact the employee. But again, your unique business may dictate the way you train, the frequency with which you communicate. Those will help you identify the time frame and the number of surveys. And so, again, doesn't mean you have to make a change, but adding on top of or overlaying additional measures are going to help.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then how can we better connect employees to our CX outcomes?
Well, I think we focused today on a couple of ways. One that I highlighted was creating a brand. I think there's a lot of value in naming your program, in creating some visuals, in reinforcing the program visually with employees. I think that's important. That can be done electronically. We showed examples where we've got posters, things that, again, are prevalent and reinforce back to the employee what we're trying to accomplish here. And then also sharing the stories from the program. What is it yielding? What have we found? What have we changed in the program? That's certainly one way to make the connection. I think the other way that we talked about is to ask employees to make the connection. Ask them from their perspective what they see, what they feel, and what they're experiencing as it relates to the customer outcomes.
And again, if we didn't answer your question during this time, we will get back with you. Jason will get back with you directly. And by the number of questions that we have, he's got his work cut out for him. So be looking for that email from him. And we want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. And hope you can join us again on May 23rd for our next MaritzCX webinar. With that, I want to close it out and thank you all very much for joining us today.